The hospital chapel smelled of candle wax and lilies and something underneath both of those scents that was harder to name, something that belonged to places where people came to grieve and pray and bargain with a God they were not entirely sure was listening. It was a small room, tucked into the ground floor of the hospital like an afterthought, with 6 wooden pews, a simple altar, and 3 stained glass windows that threw colored light across the stone floor in patterns that shifted throughout the day. At 4 in the afternoon, when the sun hit the western window at precisely the right angle, the entire chapel filled with a wash of deep gold and crimson that made the space feel holy, regardless of whether holiness actually resided there. Aria Delacroix could not see the colored light, but she could feel it. She had learned in the 14 years since she lost her sight to feel light on her skin, to register warmth and coolness in the subtle shifts that told her where windows were, where shadows fell, where the sun was in its daily arc across the sky. She could feel the chapel's golden hour on her face and hands as she sat in the front pew, her white cane resting against her knee, her fingers lightly touching the worn wood of the pew in front of her, and she knew without seeing that the room had transformed from its usual cool gray into something warm and luminous. She came here every afternoon at 4. She'd been coming for almost a year, ever since she had wandered into the hospital during a rainstorm and discovered the chapel by accident, following the sound of someone weeping through corridors that smelled of antiseptic and fear. She had found the chapel empty except for the weeping, which had turned out to be an old man sitting in the back pew, crying for his wife who was dying 3 floors above. Aria had sat beside him, not knowing what else to do, and after a while she had begun to sing. She had not planned to sing. She had simply opened her mouth and let the music come, the way it always did when she was in the presence of grief, as if her voice had its own instinct for when it was needed. The old man had stopped crying. He had listened, and when she finished, he had taken her hand and said, in a voice wrecked by sorrow, that it was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard, and that he felt, for the first time in weeks, that perhaps his wife was not going to a place of darkness, but a place where music like that existed. Aria had returned the next day, and the day after, and the day after that. She sang for anyone who came. Sometimes the chapel was empty, and she sang for the room itself, for the candles and the lilies and the colored light she could feel but not see. Sometimes there were 1 or 2 people, patients or family members, who sat in the pews and wept or prayed or simply listened. She never asked for anything. She never announced herself. She simply appeared at 4 o'clock and sang for an hour, and then she folded her cane, gathered her things, and navigated the familiar route back through the hospital corridors and out into the city streets. Today there was someone new in the chapel. Aria could tell because the room felt different the moment she entered. There was a presence in the 3rd pew, someone who breathed with the shallow, careful rhythm of a person in pain, someone whose perfume was not the antiseptic hospital smell, but something older and more personal, something that smelled of roses and prayer candles and the kind of laundry soap that grandmothers used. Aria settled into the front pew and waited. She always waited a few minutes before singing, letting the silence do its work first, letting the room settle around her like water finding its level. She listened to the new person breathing and deduced several things from the sound alone. The person was elderly, was in physical pain, was trying not to let the pain show, and was deeply tired in the way that people become tired when their bodies are failing them, and they have accepted this fact, but not yet accepted its implications. After 3 minutes of silence, Aria began to sing. She chose the Ave Maria because it was the song she always began with, the song that seemed to belong to this particular space, and because it was the song that reached people regardless of their faith or lack of faith. Her voice rose in the small chapel like something physical, filling the stone room with sound that was somehow both enormous and intimate, as if she was singing only for the person in the 3rd pew, and simultaneously for everyone who had ever sat in this chapel and prayed for something they feared they would not receive. The person in the third pew made a small sound. It was not quite a gasp and not quite a sob, but something in between. The sound of someone being touched in a place they had thought was beyond reaching. Arya heard it and felt it move through her like an electric current, and she sang more deeply, more openly, giving everything she had to the sound because she understood intuitively that this person needed the music the way a drowning person needs air. When the Ave Maria ended, the silence in the chapel was complete, and then the person spoke. "Who are you?" The voice was a woman's voice, fragile but warm, the voice of someone who had spent decades being kind and was now too weak to hide the effort that kindness required. It was the voice of someone's mother, Arya thought. It had that quality, the quality of a woman who had raised children and loved them fiercely, and was now watching her own strength slip away like sand through an hourglass. "My name is Arya," she said. "I come here to sing. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Disturbing me?" The woman laughed softly, and the laugh turned into a cough that she muffled against something soft. "Child, I have been lying in a hospital bed for 3 months, listening to machines beep and nurses whisper and doctors use words that are designed to prepare me for death without actually saying the word death. And you walk in here and sing the Ave Maria as if the angels themselves are jealous of your voice, and you ask, 'If you are disturbing me?'" Arya smiled. She liked this woman. She liked the directness, the refusal to dress reality in comfortable clothes. "Some people prefer silence in a chapel," Arya said. "Some people are fools, my lass," the woman replied. "Come, sit with me. My name is Carmela Vitale, and I would very much like to hear you sing again, if you have time for an old woman who is running out of it." Arya made her way to the third pew, navigating by sound and the gentle tap of her cane against the wooden pew ends. She sat beside Carmela and immediately felt the warmth of the older woman's hand reaching for hers. The hand that found Arya's was small and thin, the skin papery, the bones prominent beneath it. A rosary was wrapped around the wrist, the beads warm from being held. "You are blind," Carmela said. It was not a question. "Yes." "How long?" "Since I was 12, a car accident. My parents were killed." Carmela's hand tightened around Arya's. "And yet, you come here to a place full of dying people, and you sing for them. You give them beauty when you could be angry at the world for what it took from you." "I was angry," Arya said, "for a long time. But anger is exhausting, and it doesn't change anything. Singing changes things. I can feel it when I sing for people who are suffering. Something shifts in the room. Something opens. I don't know what it is exactly, but I know it matters." "It matters," Carmela whispered. "It matters more than you know." They sat together for an hour. Arya sang 3 more songs. A Neapolitan folk song about fishermen and the sea, an aria from La Bohème that made Carmela weep openly, and a lullaby that Arya's own mother had sung to her before the accident, before everything changed. Between songs they talked, and Arya learned that Carmela was dying of pancreatic cancer, that she had a son who visited every day, that she was at peace with her death but grieved for the son she would leave behind. "He is a complicated man," Carmela said carefully. "He has made choices that I cannot approve of. He has done things that keep me awake at night praying for his soul. But he is my son, and I love him with every broken piece of my heart. And I know with absolute certainty that underneath everything he has become, there is still the boy I raised, the boy who used to bring me wildflowers from the hillside and put them in a jar beside my bed." Arya listened and said nothing. She understood complicated men. She had grown up in a neighborhood where complicated men were the norm, where the line between violence and tenderness was blurred by poverty and desperation and the crushing weight of limited options. "Will you come back tomorrow?" Carmela asked as Arya prepared to leave. "I come every day at 4. "Then I will be here every day at 4. If they have to wheel my bed down the corridor, I will be here. Because your voice, child, your voice is the closest thing to grace I have felt in months, and I am running out of time for grace. Arya found Carmela's hand and squeezed it gently. I'll be here, she said. I promise. She made her way out of the hospital with her cane, tapping its familiar rhythm on the linoleum floors, through the automatic doors that whooshed open as she approached, into the late afternoon heat of the coastal city. The air outside smelled of salt and exhaust, and the distant sweetness of jasmine from the gardens across the street. She could feel the sun still warm on her face, lower now, beginning its descent toward the sea that she could hear but not see. The constant whisper of waves against the harbor walls that served as her compass in this city she had learned to navigate by sound and memory and the particular quality of light against her skin. She did not know that she was being watched. If this story is already pulling at your heartstrings, if you can feel the connection forming between these two women, and you want to know what happens next, take a moment to subscribe to Crimson Vow Tales. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. This journey is just beginning, and trust me, you are not ready for where it goes. Dominic Vitale arrived at the hospital at 6:30 that evening, as he did every evening, carrying a paper bag containing his mother's favorite pastries from a bakery in the old quarter that she had patronized for 40 years. He walked through the hospital corridors with the particular gait of a man accustomed to owning every room he entered, his bodyguard Marco trailing 3 steps behind, his dark eyes registering everything and revealing nothing. The nurses at the station nodded as he passed. They knew who he was. Everyone in this city knew who Dominic Vitale was. He found his mother's room on the 4th floor and pushed open the door, expecting to find her in the usual state of medicated drowsiness that characterized her evenings. Instead, he found her sitting up in bed, her eyes bright, her thin face animated with something he had not seen in weeks. She was smiling. Not the careful, managed smile she gave the doctors when they delivered bad news with practiced gentleness. A real smile. A smile that belonged to the mother he remembered from childhood. The mother who had been full of warmth and laughter and an inexhaustible belief in the goodness of things. Dominic, she said, and even her voice sounded different, stronger, as if someone had opened a window in a room that had been sealed shut for months and let fresh air rush in. Mama. He kissed her forehead and set the pastries on the bedside table. You look better tonight. I feel better tonight. Something wonderful happened today. There is a woman who sings in the chapel downstairs. I went to hear her, and Dominic, I cannot describe it to you in words that would do it justice. Her voice is like nothing I have ever heard. It is like hearing God speak through a human throat. It is like being carried somewhere safe and warm and beautiful, even when your body is betraying you, and your bones ache and your blood is turning against you. Dominic sat in the chair beside her bed and watched his mother describe the singer with an enthusiasm that bordered on reverence. He listened carefully, as he always did when his mother spoke, because she was the only person in the world whose words he trusted completely, the only person who had never lied to him, never manipulated him, never wanted anything from him except that he be a better man than he was. Her name is Arya, Carmela continued. She's young, maybe mid-20s, and she is blind, Dominic. She cannot see. She lost her sight as a child, lost her parents in the same accident, and yet she comes to this hospital every single day and sings for the dying. She gives them something I cannot give myself no matter how hard I pray. She gives them peace. Dominic felt something shift in his chest, a stirring beneath the layers of hardness and violence that had calcified around his heart over the past 2 decades. It was not pity, exactly, though the story of a blind orphan singing for dying strangers contained all the elements of pity. It was something more like recognition. The recognition that somewhere in this city, a woman who had lost everything was still capable of giving everything, and that this capacity for generosity in the face of loss was something he had not encountered in his world of transaction and threat and carefully maintained power. "I want to hear her," he said. "Come tomorrow at 4. She comes every day at 4. Dominic returned the next afternoon at 3:45. He told Marco to wait outside the chapel, which was unusual because Dominic never went anywhere without protection. But the chapel felt like a space that did not permit bodyguards, that demanded something more honest than the performance of power. He sat in the last pew, in the shadows near the door, and he waited. At 4 o'clock precisely, the chapel door opened, and he heard the tap of a cane on stone. A woman entered, small and slight, moving with a confidence that seemed to contradict her blindness. She wore a dove-gray dress that fell to her ankles, flat shoes, and her hair, black as ink, hung loose to her waist. Her face was turned slightly upward as she walked, as if she was listening to something in the ceiling, something only she could hear. Her eyes were pale, almost colorless, beautiful and empty as frosted glass. She settled into the front pew, placed her cane against the seat beside her, and sat in silence for several minutes. Dominic watched her from the shadows and felt his breathing slow, felt the perpetual tension in his body begin to ease, as if her very presence was an analgesic. Then she began to sing. The sound hit Dominic like a physical blow. He had heard beautiful music before. He had attended operas in Milan and concerts in Rome. He had heard the world's most celebrated voices amplified through concert halls designed to make the human voice sound superhuman. But he had never heard anything like this. Her voice was not merely beautiful, it was true. It contained no artifice, no performance, no awareness of its own power. It was simply the sound of a human being opening herself completely, holding nothing back, pouring everything she had ever felt and suffered and hoped into a stream of sound that filled the small chapel like water filling a vessel. She sang the Ave Maria, and Dominic, who had not prayed since he was a teenager, who had long since abandoned the faith his mother had raised him in, felt tears on his face. He was not a man who cried. He had not cried when his father died. He had not cried when he had taken his first life at 22. He had not cried when the doctor had told him his mother's cancer was terminal. But sitting in the back of a hospital chapel, listening to a blind woman sing as if singing was the only thing standing between the world and total darkness, he wept. He wept for his mother, who was dying. He wept for himself, who had spent his adult life becoming a man his mother could not be proud of. He wept for the years of violence, the blood on his hands, the choices that had seemed necessary and now seemed monstrous. And he wept for the woman in the front pew, who could not see the colored light falling on her shoulders, who could not see the tears on a stranger's face in the shadows behind her, but who could somehow, through the pure act of singing, make a broken man feel that brokenness was not the end of the story. When the singing stopped, Dominic sat in the silence and composed himself. He wiped his face with his hands, felt the roughness of his scarred knuckles against his cheeks, and understood that something fundamental had shifted inside him. He did not have a name for it. He did not trust it, but he could not deny it. He left the chapel without speaking to her. He was not ready to speak to her. He was not sure he would ever be ready to speak to her. He was a man who had blood on his hands, and a crucifix around his neck, and a dying mother in a bed 4 floors above, and this woman with her voice like grace was something he did not know how to approach without contaminating. He came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. For 2 weeks, Dominic sat in the back pew of the hospital chapel every afternoon at 4 o'clock and listened to Aria Delacroix sing. He never spoke to her. He never announced his presence. He sat in the shadows and he listened, and each day the singing peeled away another layer of the armor he had spent decades building, exposing something raw and tender underneath that he was simultaneously terrified of and desperate to protect. His mother noticed the change. She saw it in the softening of his jaw when he visited her in the evenings, in the way his eyes seemed less guarded, in the slight tremor of his hands when he held hers. She said nothing about it, because, Carmela Vitale was a woman who understood that some transformations needed to happen in silence, that naming them too early could frighten them away. But she prayed. She prayed harder than she had prayed for anything in her life, including her own healing. She prayed that the woman with the extraordinary voice and the blind eyes would somehow find her way into her son's heart, because Carmela knew, with the certainty of a dying woman, that Dominic's soul depended on learning to love something he could not control, could not purchase, could not threaten into submission. On the 15th day, Arya did not come. Dominic arrived at the chapel at 3:40, as had become his habit, and sat in his usual pew. 4 o'clock came, 4:15, 4:30. The chapel remained empty. The silence, which had always felt peaceful in the minutes before she sang, now felt oppressive, heavy with absence. He waited until 5 o'clock, his body rigid with a tension he did not understand, an anxiety that was wildly disproportionate to the situation. She was a stranger. She owed him nothing. She did not even know he existed. And yet her absence felt like an emergency, like something fundamental had gone wrong with the world. He went to his mother's room. Carmela was agitated. "She didn't come," she said before he could speak. "Something is wrong. She has never missed a day in almost a year. Dominic, I need you to find her. I need to know she is safe." Dominic looked at his mother and saw in her eyes the same urgency he was feeling, and he realized that this was not merely concern. This was something deeper. His mother had formed a bond with Arya in the hours they spent together in the chapel, a bond that existed outside the boundaries of his knowledge, a connection between two women that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the human need for beauty in the face of death. "I'll find her," he said. He called Lucia, his intelligence coordinator, a woman in her 50s who had been gathering information for the Vitale family for 2 decades. "I need information on a woman," he said, and he gave her what he had: a first name, a description, the fact that she was blind, the fact that she sang in the hospital chapel. "Within 24 hours, Lucia said. Dominic spent a nearly sleepless night in his compound on the waterfront, sitting at his desk, Simistav, in the room with the bulletproof windows, overlooking the Mediterranean, the room where he made decisions that affected hundreds of lives, the room where he had ordered things done that he could never undo. Tonight the room felt different. The power he normally felt in this space felt hollow, inadequate. The kind of power that could find a person, that could mobilize an entire intelligence network in a matter of hours, suddenly seemed crude and insufficient compared to the power of a voice singing in a chapel. Lucia called him at 7 the next morning. Her name is Arya Delacroix, 26 years old, half French, half Italian. She has been blind since age 12, the result of a car accident that killed both her parents on the coastal highway just outside the city. She was in the back seat. She survived with severe head trauma that destroyed her optic nerves. She spent 2 years in a rehabilitation facility, then moved to a series of foster homes. She lives alone now, above a bakery called Pane del Mattino on Via Santo Rosario in the Old Quarter. She earns money singing on the street, mostly in the tourist areas near the harbor, and she volunteers at several hospitals and care facilities. She has no criminal record, no debts, no known associates of any concern. Dominic listened in silence. Each detail landed like a weight on his chest. She appears to be, Lucia concluded, exactly what she seems. A good person living a small, quiet life. There's nothing in her background that raises any flags. Why didn't she come to the hospital yesterday? I'm still working on that. But the bakery owner, a woman named Maria Fontana, told one of my contacts that Arya had been feeling unwell. A cold or flu, nothing serious. Relief flooded through Dominic with an intensity that shocked him. He had faced assassination attempts with more composure than he was currently demonstrating over a stranger's head cold. Thank you, Lucia. He went to the hospital that afternoon at 4. The chapel was empty again. He sat in his pew and waited for 30 minutes, and when it became clear she was not coming, he experienced something unfamiliar. the impulse to go to her. Not to send someone, not to have information gathered. To go himself, in person, to Via Santo Rosario, to the bakery called Pane del Mattino, and to see with his own eyes that she was safe. He drove to the old quarter with only Marco, his most trusted man. The streets were narrow and crowded, the buildings ancient, the air thick with the smells of cooking and the sound of radios playing through open windows. Via Santo Rosario was a quiet side street off the main market road, lined with apartments that had laundry hanging from their balconies and flower boxes overflowing with geraniums. The bakery was small, with a faded hand-painted sign and a display window filled with bread and pastries. The smell that came through the open door was extraordinary. The smell of yeast and honey and almonds, the smell of something honest and nourishing being created by human hands. Dominic pushed open the door, and a small bell chimed above his head. The woman behind the counter, Maria Fontana, was in her 60s, round and flour-dusted, with shrewd dark eyes that took in Dominic's suit and his bodyguard and his general aura of controlled menace, and arrived at an accurate conclusion about who he was. "What can I get for you?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "I'm looking for Aria Delacroix. She lives upstairs." Maria's expression shifted into something protective, something that said clearly that she had appointed herself this young woman's guardian and would not relinquish the post without a fight. "Aria doesn't receive visitors. She's a private person." Dominic had prepared for this. "She visits my mother at the hospital, sings in the chapel. My mother is dying, and Aria's voice has been the only thing bringing her peace. She hasn't come for 2 days, and my mother is worried." It was the truth, mostly, which made it more convincing than any of the elaborate lies he was capable of constructing. Maria studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "She's been ill. A bad cold. I'll tell her you came by. I'd like to see her, just for a moment, to tell her that my mother is asking for her." Maria considered this, then sighed and disappeared through a door in the back. Dominic stood in the warm bakery surrounded by the evidence of a life entirely unlike his own, a life built on flour and labor and early mornings and the simple act of feeding people, and he felt the gap between this world and his own as a physical distance, a chasm he was not sure he could cross. Footsteps on wooden stairs, and then she was there. Aria stood in the doorway behind the counter, smaller than he remembered, her black hair loose around her shoulders, her pale eyes directed somewhere past his left shoulder. She wore a cream-colored sweater that was too large for her, soft pants, no shoes. She held her white cane loosely. Her nose was slightly red, and she looked tired, but she was there, she was alive, she was whole, and the relief Dominic felt was so powerful it nearly buckled his knees. "Maria says someone is here about the hospital," Aria said. Her voice in conversation was different from her singing voice, quieter and more guarded, but still beautiful, still carrying that quality of absolute honesty that made everything she said sound like the truth. "My name is Dominic," he said, and his own voice sounded strange to him, rougher than usual, stripped of its customary authority. "My mother is a patient, Carmela Vitale. She tells me that you sing in the chapel every afternoon and that your singing has brought her more comfort than anything else in 3 months of treatment." Something shifted in Aria's face, a softening. "Carmela," she repeated. "Yes, she comes every day. We talk sometimes after I sing. She's a beautiful person. I'm sorry I haven't been there. I caught something, and I didn't want to risk bringing it into the hospital. She's worried about you. She asked me to find you." "Your mother asked you to find me." Aria tilted her head the way she did when she was listening with more than her ears. "And you came yourself. You didn't send someone." It was an observation, not a question, and it carried a weight that Dominic was not prepared for. She had, in a single sentence, identified the most significant thing about his visit, that he had come in person, that the man who sent intermediaries for everything, who maintained distance as a survival strategy, had walked into a bakery in the old quarter and asked to see her face to face. "My mother doesn't ask for much," he said. "When she asks, I come." "That's not the only reason you're here," Arya said softly. "I can hear it in your voice. There's something else. Something you're not saying." Dominic stood in the warm bakery, surrounded by the smell of bread and the gaze of a woman who could not see him, but who seemed to be looking straight through him, and he felt entirely exposed. He was a man who had built his life on control, on the ability to hide his intentions, to mask his emotions, to reveal only what served his purposes, and this small blind woman with the cold and the too big sweater had stripped all of that away in 30 seconds. "I've been listening to you sing," he admitted. "In the chapel, for 2 weeks. I sit in the back pew. You didn't know I was there." "I knew someone was there," Arya said. "I could hear your breathing. It changed every day. The first day, you were holding everything in, and by the end of the song you had let go of something. I could hear it in the rhythm of your breathing, the way it deepened and slowed. Each day after that, you let go of a little more." Dominic stared at her. The fact that she had detected his presence, had tracked his emotional state through the sound of his breathing alone, was both extraordinary and unsettling. He was a man who prided himself on being invisible when he chose to be, on controlling every signal his body transmitted, and she had read him like a book, with her ears instead of her eyes. "Come back tomorrow," Arya said. "I should be well enough to sing by then. And bring your mother a pastry from Maria. The ones with almond cream. She told me she loves them." Dominic nodded, then caught himself, remembering that she could not see the gesture. "I will," he said. "Thank you." He bought 6 almond pastries from Maria, who watched the transaction with narrowed eyes and a protective set to her jaw, and he left the bakery and walked back to his car in the golden late afternoon light, and he understood with absolute clarity that he was in trouble. Not the kind of trouble he was accustomed to managing, not the kind that involved rivals and territory and the complex chess game of criminal enterprise. This was different. This was the kind of trouble that begins when a man who has spent his life avoiding vulnerability meets a woman who is made entirely of it and discovers that her vulnerability is not weakness, but a kind of power that makes everything he has built look like a sandcastle waiting for the tide. The next afternoon, Arya was back in the chapel. Dominic arrived at 3:45 and took his place in the last pew. At 4 o'clock, the chapel door opened, and Arya entered with her cane tapping softly on the stone floor. She settled into the front pew, waited her customary 3 minutes of silence, and then she sang. But today she sang something different. Not the Ave Maria, not the Neapolitan folk songs, not the opera arias that she usually favored. Today she sang a song he did not recognize, something raw and unhurried, something that sounded like it had been written for this specific moment, in this specific chapel, for the specific purpose of reaching the man sitting in the shadows behind her. The song was about a man who had forgotten how to feel, who had armored himself so completely against the world's pain that he had also sealed himself off from its beauty. It was about the slow process of thawing, of ice melting, of something green and tentative pushing up through frozen ground. It was about the terrifying courage required to allow another person to matter to you, when mattering had always been a liability, when caring had always been a weapon your enemies could use against you. Dominic sat in his pew and let the music wash over him and understood that she was singing for him. She knew he was there. She had always known. And she was telling him, through the only language she trusted completely, that she understood who he was, what he was afraid of, and why he kept coming back to sit in the shadows and listen. When the song ended, the silence in the chapel felt different than usual. It felt expectant. It felt like a door had been left open. Dominic stood and walked forward. His footsteps on the stone floor were loud in the silence, and he saw Arya turn her head toward the sound, tracking him with the precision of someone who navigated the entire world by ear. "I brought the pastries," he said, because it was the only thing he could think to say. and because it was concrete and manageable and did not require him to acknowledge the volcanic shift happening inside his chest. Arya smiled. "Sit down," she said. "The second pew to my left. That's the one with the best light at this hour. I can feel it on my face." He sat where she indicated, and the colored light from the stained glass windows fell on them both, gold and crimson and deep violet, and they talked. They talked for 2 hours. They talked as the light shifted from gold to amber to the soft gray of early evening. They talked as the chapel grew dim around them and the candles on the altar became the only source of warmth. They talked, and Dominic found himself telling this woman things he had never told anyone. Not his mother, not his closest lieutenants, not the priest who occasionally heard his confession in a church across town where nobody knew who he was. He told her about his father's death when he was 17, and how the old man's enemies had come to the funeral and smiled, and how Dominic had sworn on his father's grave to make them stop smiling. He told her about the first man he had killed, a rival who had threatened Carmela, and how the act of killing had changed something in him permanently, had sealed a door inside him that he had never been able to reopen. He told her about the empire he had built, the territory he controlled, the hundreds of men who answered to him, and how all of it felt meaningless now that his mother was dying, and there was no one in the world who would mourn the good parts of him, because no one except Carmela had ever seen them. Arya listened without judgment. She did not flinch at the violence. She did not recoil from the admissions of a man who had spent his adult life doing terrible things. She simply listened, her pale eyes directed somewhere past his shoulder, her hands folded in her lap, the little bell on her bracelet occasionally chiming when she shifted her weight. And then she said something that broke him open entirely. "You are not what you have done," she said. "You are what you do next." It was not an original thought. It was the kind of thing a therapist might say, or a priest, or a self-help book. But in Arya's voice, delivered without judgment or sentimentality, it sounded like the truest thing Dominic had ever heard. It sounded like permission. Permission to stop defining himself by the worst things he had done. Permission to imagine a different future. Permission to believe that the man his mother prayed for him to become was not a fantasy, but a possibility. He came to the chapel every day after that. Not just to listen, but to talk. To sit with Arya in the colored light and discover, slowly and painfully, what it felt like to be known by someone who could not see you, but who somehow saw everything. Every moment of this story matters, from the first note of Arya's voice to the choice Dominic is making right now to let someone see the real him. If you're feeling this, if you're rooting for these two, please take a second to like this video and drop a comment telling me what you think will happen next. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that button so you never miss another tale of dark love and redemption on Crimson Vow Tales. The relationship between Dominic and Arya developed with a slowness that was unlike anything Dominic had experienced. In his world, things moved fast. Decisions were made in seconds. Alliances formed and dissolved in hours. But Arya existed outside the velocity of his criminal empire, in a slower rhythm governed by the tap of her cane and the 4 o'clock singing and the careful way she navigated the world, learning each new space by touch and sound and the subtle clues that sighted people never noticed. He learned to slow down with her. He learned to describe things because she asked him to, and in describing the world to her, he began to see it differently himself. The sunset over the harbor was not just a sunset. It was a wash of colors that he had to find words for, oranges and pinks, and the deep bruised purple at the horizon line. And the process of finding those words made him pay attention to beauty in a way he never had before. One afternoon, after the singing was finished and they were sitting together in the chapel as the light faded from gold to amber, Arya asked him to describe the stained glass windows. He looked at them, really looked, for the first time despite having sat beneath them for weeks. "There are 3 windows," he said. The first one shows what I think is the Annunciation, an angel with blue wings standing before a woman in a white robe. The glass is old and some of the pieces have faded, so the angel looks almost translucent, like you could see through it. The second window shows a garden, a kind of paradise, with green trees and golden fruit and birds that are either doves or something the artist imagined but never actually saw. And the third window, the one that catches the afternoon sun, shows a woman holding a child. I think it is meant to be Mary with the infant Christ, but the way the light comes through it, the warm gold and the deep red, it looks less like a religious painting and more like a portrait of someone real, someone who loved their child with everything they had. Arya was silent for a moment. You described that beautifully. Why, she said. Most people would have just said religious scenes and left it at that. You noticed the faded angel. You noticed that the birds might be imagined. You paid attention. I never paid attention before, Dominic admitted, to anything like this. My world is about information, about threat assessment, about reading a room to determine who is dangerous and who is useful. I have spent my entire adult life looking at the world through the lens of survival. You are teaching me to look at it through a different lens. What lens is that? Beauty. Just beauty. The idea that something can exist without serving a purpose, without being useful, without being a weapon or a shield, that it can simply be beautiful, and that is enough. Arya reached out and found his hand, and the touch of her fingers against his scarred knuckles was so gentle that it made his chest ache. That is the beginning of everything, Ikari, she said. When you can see beauty without needing to own it or control it or use it, you have taken the first step toward being free. Their meetings extended beyond the chapel. Dominic began walking Arya home in the evenings, through the narrow streets of the old quarter that she knew by heart, but that he was learning for the first time. She navigated with astonishing confidence, her white cane tapping a rhythm on the cobblestones, her body attuned to currents of air and the acoustics of the streets that told her exactly where she was. He walked beside her, matching her pace, which was slower than his but more deliberate, more present, more aware of the world passing around them. She taught him to listen. Close your eyes, she said one evening as they walked past the harbor. Tell me what you hear. He closed his eyes and listened, and the world changed entirely. Without sight, the city became a symphony of overlapping sounds. The lap of water against boat hulls, the distant clatter of dishes from a restaurant, a child laughing somewhere above them on a balcony, the low throb of a fishing boat engine heading out for the night catch, the wind catching the rigging of sailboats and making them sing like some strange instrument. He heard the city breathing, heard its rhythms and melodies, and he understood for the first time how Arya experienced the world, how rich and textured and complete her reality was, despite the absence of sight. It's extraordinary, he said, opening his eyes. I had no idea how much I was missing. You weren't missing it, Arya said. You were just listening with only one sense. Most people do. They see the world and think they know it. But the world is more than what is visible. It is what you hear, what you feel on your skin, what you smell in the air, what you taste on your tongue. When I lost my sight, I didn't lose the world. I found a different version of it, a version that most sighted people will never experience because they are too busy looking to listen. On another evening, she took him to the place where she sang. During the mornings, a small square near the harbor, where tourists gathered to drink espresso and watch the fishing boats. She stood in the center of the square, and Dominic leaned against a wall and watched as she began to sing. The song was different from the chapel songs, lighter and more playful, an old Italian love song about a fisherman's wife who waited on the shore every evening for her husband to return. The tourists stopped their conversations and turned toward the sound. Children paused in their games. An old man sitting on a bench began to cry, his weathered face crumpling with the weight of some private memory that the song had unlocked. Dominic watched all of this, and felt a combination of pride and wonder and something close to fear. Pride because this extraordinary woman was choosing to spend her time with him, a man who did not deserve her attention, let alone her affection. Wonder because her gift was so vast, so generous, so freely given to strangers who had done nothing to earn it. And fear because he was falling in love with her, and love was the one thing his world had taught him was the most dangerous vulnerability of all. He began to notice things about her that deepened his understanding of who she was. The way she kept her apartment meticulously organized, every object in its assigned place, not out of compulsion, but out of necessity. The way she cooked by smell and touch and an internal clock that told her exactly when the pasta was al dente, when the sauce had reduced enough, when the bread was ready to come out of the oven. The way she read Braille with her fingers, moving across the pages with the same fluid grace that sighted people's eyes moved across printed text. The way she laughed, a full-throated sound that came from deep in her body and filled whatever room she was in with warmth. He noticed the small scar along her left temple and wanted to touch it but did not, because he understood that the scar was a monument to the worst day of her life, the day she lost her parents and her sight in the same violent moment, and that touching it uninvited would be a violation of something sacred. He noticed the silver bracelet with its tiny bell and learned its story. Her mother had given it to her on the morning of the accident, a birthday gift for her 12th birthday. They had been driving to a restaurant to celebrate, Arya in the back seat with the bracelet on her wrist and a feeling of invincible childhood joy, when a truck ran a red light and their world ended. She had woken up in a hospital 2 weeks later, blind, orphaned, and wearing a bracelet with a bell that would never stop reminding her of everything she had lost. "Why do you still wear it?" Dominic asked one evening as they sat on the bench outside the bakery, the street quiet around them, the smell of jasmine drifting from a garden somewhere nearby. "Because it is the last thing she gave me," Arya said, "and because the sound of the bell is my mother's voice. Every time it chimes, she is speaking to me. She is saying, 'I am still here. I am still with you. Even though you cannot see me, I am here.'" Dominic understood this in a way he had not expected. He wore his father's crucifix for similar reasons, not out of faith but out of love, out of the need to carry something physical that connected him to someone who was gone. The crucifix and the bell bracelet were the same gesture, the same refusal to let the dead be completely dead, the same insistence that love persisted beyond the reach of mortality. He visited Carmela every evening, and his mother watched his transformation with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has prayed for a miracle and received one. She never asked about Arya directly, but she knew. She knew because his voice was softer, because his hands were gentler, because there was something in his eyes that had not been there 3 months ago, something that looked like hope. Arya met Carmela formally on a Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks after Dominic had come to her bakery. Dominic brought her to the hospital in his car, driving slowly through the streets while Arya sat in the passenger seat with her window down. Her face turned into the wind like a dog savoring every scent. She wore a pale blue dress and her silver bracelet, and she looked, Dominic thought, like something from a painting. Carmela was sitting up in bed when they arrived, and her face when she saw Arya in the doorway, when she understood that her son had brought this woman to her, not as a stranger, but as someone who mattered, was a study in joy. Pure joy, uncomplicated by pain or fear or the knowledge that she had weeks to live. "You brought her," Carmela whispered. "She wanted to meet you properly," Dominic said, though in truth it had been his idea because he wanted the two women who had changed his life to know each other, to see what he saw in each of them, to create a connection that would outlast his mother's remaining days. Arya sat beside Carmela's bed and took her hand, and the two women talked for an hour while Dominic sat in the corner and watched. They talked about faith and music and the particular quality of light in the chapel at 4 o'clock. They talked about Dominic, carefully, the way women talk about a man they both love, acknowledging his faults with the gentle firmness of people who have chosen to see past them. "He is becoming someone new," Carmela told Arya. "I can see it. You have given him something I could not give him, no matter how many years I prayed." "I haven't given him anything," Arya said. "He is finding it himself. All I did was sing." "That is everything," Carmela said. "Sometimes all it takes is a single beautiful thing to remind a person that beauty exists. You are that thing for my son. You are his proof that the world is not only violence and transaction and the exercise of power. You are his proof that grace is real." Arya sang for Carmela that afternoon in the hospital room, not in the chapel, but there beside the bed, holding the dying woman's hand as she sang. She sang the Ave Maria, and then she sang a song that Carmela requested, an old Italian hymn about the mercy of God and the promise of eternal rest. Carmela wept as she listened, and Dominic wept watching her weep, and Arya sang through her own tears, her blind eyes glistening, her voice never faltering despite the grief that was pouring through it. The weeks that followed were a strange mixture of beauty and sorrow. Carmela's condition deteriorated steadily. The cancer was advancing, and the doctors spoke in increasingly careful terms about comfort, care, and quality of remaining time. But within the dying, there was living. There was Arya's voice, filling Carmela's room twice a day now, morning and afternoon, because Dominic had arranged it. There were conversations between the three of them that covered everything from theology to cooking to the proper way to prepare a Neapolitan ragu. There was laughter, which surprised everyone, because laughter seemed inappropriate in a dying woman's hospital room, but which Carmela insisted on, because she said that dying was no reason to stop finding things funny. Dominic began the process of disentangling himself from his empire. He did not announce this. He did not make dramatic declarations. He simply began, quietly and methodically, to delegate authority, to transfer knowledge, to prepare his organization for a transition that no one except he and a few trusted lieutenants knew was coming. He did this because Arya had not asked him to. He did this because his mother had spent 64 years praying for it. He did this because every time he sat in the chapel and listened to Arya sing, he understood more clearly that the life he had built was incompatible with the life he wanted to build, and that the man his mother saw in him, the man Arya was teaching him to become, could not coexist with the man who controlled the shipping routes and the construction contracts and the politicians. This was when Sergio Bianchi became a problem. Sergio had been circling Dominic's territory for months, a predator waiting for any sign of weakness. He was a different kind of dangerous than Dominic. Where Dominic operated through loyalty and the threat of violence, Sergio operated through manipulation, through leverage, through the patient accumulation of compromising information. He had connections in local government, ties to international money launderers, and a reputation for destroying people, not through force, but through the systematic dismantling of everything they cared about. He had noticed Dominic's visits to the hospital. He had noticed the shift in Dominic's attention, the way the feared Mafia boss was spending less time managing his empire and more time at the bedside of a dying woman. Sergio saw this as weakness, and he began to probe for vulnerabilities with the methodical patience of a surgeon, looking for the right place to make an incision. His men followed Dominic to the bakery on Via Santo Rosario. They identified Arya. They reported back to Sergio that the feared Dominic Vitale, the man who had controlled the city through violence for 15 years, was spending his afternoons listening to a blind street singer in a hospital chapel. Sergio laughed when he heard this. He laughed the way a man laughs when he discovers that his enemy has a heart, because a heart is the most exploitable vulnerability there is. The first threat came on a Tuesday morning, delivered to Dominic's compound in a plain envelope. Inside was a photograph of Arya walking down Via Santo Rosario with her white cane, taken from across the street. On the back of the photograph, in neat handwriting, She's lovely. It would be a shame if something happened to her. Dominic's reaction was immediate and visceral. He felt a surge of rage so intense that it blurred his vision, a primal instinct to find Sergio and destroy him with his bare hands, to make an example so brutal that no one would ever threaten someone he loved again. This was the old Dominic, the Dominic who had built an empire on the willingness to do whatever was necessary to protect what was his. But something stopped him. Not fear, not calculation, but the echo of Arya's voice in the chapel, singing about transformation, about the possibility of choosing a different response. The echo of his mother's prayers, asking God to make her son into something better than a weapon. He sat at his desk with the photograph in front of him and forced himself to think clearly. Sergio wanted a reaction. Sergio wanted Dominic to come at him with violence, because violence was a language Sergio could use against him, could document, could leverage with his government contacts. Sergio wanted Dominic to prove that he was still the same man he had always been, because that man was predictable, and predictable enemies were controllable enemies. Dominic chose a different path. He increased security around Arya's building without her knowledge. He placed men on Via Santo Rosario, men who looked like shopkeepers and delivery drivers, but who carried weapons beneath their aprons and in their vans. He did this not through violence, but through the deployment of resources, through the careful arrangement of protection that was invisible to everyone except the men providing it. And then he went to see Sergio. He went alone, no bodyguard, no weapon. He went to the office building where Sergio conducted his legitimate business, a gleaming glass tower near the harbor that housed a real estate development firm that existed primarily to launder money. He walked past the receptionist, who was too frightened to stop him, past the assistants, who scattered like startled birds, and into Sergio's corner office with its panoramic view of the Mediterranean. Sergio was sitting behind his desk. He looked up when Dominic entered, and his thin lips curved into a smile that did not reach his pale, watery eyes. He was wearing a light gray suit with gold cufflinks, and he smelled of too much cologne. "Dominic," he said, as if greeting a friend. "What a pleasant surprise." "I got your photograph," Dominic said. He did not sit down. He stood in the center of the office and let his presence fill the room the way it always did. Not with threat exactly, but with the absolute certainty that he was the more dangerous man in any room he occupied. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sergio said, still smiling. "Let me be very clear," Dominic said, his voice low and controlled. "You will not go near her. You will not photograph her. You will not have her followed. You will not use her name in any conversation with any person for any reason. If you do, I will dismantle everything you have built, not with violence. I won't touch you. I will use the information I have about your money laundering operations, your connections to the Calabrese family in the South, and your arrangement with the harbor master to import goods that never appear on any manifest. I will deliver that information to people who will use it to put you in a prison cell for the rest of your natural life." The smile faded from Sergio's face. For the first time, something like uncertainty flickered in his pale eyes. "You're bluffing." "I've never bluffed in my life, Lot," Dominic said, "and you know that." He turned and walked out of the office without waiting for a response. He walked through the gleaming lobby, past the frightened receptionist, out into the sunlight, and he drove to the hospital where his mother was waiting, where Arya would be singing at 4:00, where the colored light would fall through the stained glass windows and make the small chapel feel like the only sacred space left in a city built on corruption and compromise. Sergio did not heed the warning. Men like Sergio never did. They mistook restraint for weakness, mistook the decision not to use violence as an inability to use it. 2 weeks later, a second envelope arrived. This time it contained photographs of Arya at the hospital, at the chapel, at the bakery, and a note. "Your retirement from business requires my approval, which you have not received. Return to your duties, or the blind girl pays the price." This time, Dominic did not go to Sergio's office. This time, he gathered information. He spent a week compiling evidence with the meticulous attention to detail that had made him the most successful criminal operator in the coastal city. He documented Sergio's money laundering operations, his connections to corrupt officials, his involvement in 3 unsolved disappearances that the police had quietly shelved under pressure from Sergio's government allies. He compiled the information into a dossier and delivered copies to 3 separate sources: a federal prosecutor in Rome who had been trying to build a case against Sergio for years, a journalist at the national newspaper who had a reputation for pursuing corruption stories, regardless of the consequences, and a rival of Sergio's in the Southern families who would find the information extremely useful in an ongoing territorial dispute. Within 72 hours, Sergio Bianchi's world began to collapse. The federal prosecutor obtained warrants. The journalist published a series of articles that made national headlines. The Southern rival moved against Sergio's operations in 3 cities simultaneously. Sergio's government allies, faced with the choice between protecting a man who was now toxic and preserving their own careers, abandoned him with the speed of rats leaving a burning building. Sergio was arrested on a Thursday morning. Dominic heard about it from Lucia while he was sitting in the hospital chapel, waiting for Arya to arrive. He received the news with a quietness that surprised him. There was no triumph. There was no satisfaction. There was only relief, and beneath the relief, the understanding that he had chosen a different path, that he had defeated his enemy not through violence but through information, through patience, through the willingness to be strategic rather than brutal. It was the first time in his life he had won a fight without blood on his hands. Arya arrived at 4 o'clock that afternoon, and Dominic walked to the front of the chapel and sat beside her in the second pew, in the colored light, where she had told him the light was best. "Something is different about you today," she said, tilting her head, listening to him with her entire body. "Something has resolved. A weight has lifted. A problem has been dealt with," he said. "Someone who was threatening the people I care about. He won't be a threat anymore." Arya reached out and found his hand. Her fingers were cool and delicate, and the silver bell on her bracelet chimed softly as she moved. "Did you hurt him?" she asked, and there was no judgment in the question, only the need to know. "No, I didn't hurt him. I didn't touch him. I used information. I used the truth." Arya squeezed his hand. "That is who you are becoming," she said. "That is the man your mother sees when she looks at you, the man who chooses a different way." Carmela died on a Wednesday afternoon in late autumn, when the light through her hospital window was the color of honey and the air smelled of rain coming in off the sea. Dominic was holding her right hand. Arya was holding her left, singing softly, the Ave Maria, the same song she had sung on the first day, the song that had brought them all together in a chapel that smelled of candle wax and lilies. Carmela's last words were addressed to both of them. "Take care of each other," she whispered. "Promise me. Promise me that you will love each other the way I love you, with everything, holding nothing back, refusing to let the darkness win." "I promise, Mama," Dominic said, and his voice broke on the words. "I promise," Arya whispered, and the bell on her bracelet chimed as if in confirmation. Carmela closed her eyes and exhaled, a long, slow breath that carried with it 64 years of love and faith and the unshakable belief that her son could be saved. And then she was gone, and the room was silent except for the distant sound of the sea and the quiet weeping of a man who had finally learned how to cry. The grief that followed was vast and total. Dominic had never allowed himself to feel this deeply before, and the full weight of losing his mother hit him with a force that his years of violence had not prepared him for. He could handle being shot at. He could handle betrayal and threat and the constant pressure of running a criminal empire. But this, the simple devastating reality of a world without his mother in it, was beyond anything his strength could manage. The first night after Carmela died, Dominic sat alone in his compound on the waterfront and stared at the Mediterranean through bulletproof glass and understood that the sea had not changed, that the waves still moved in their eternal rhythm, that the fishing boats still went out and came back, that the world continued its rotation without pause or acknowledgement that the best person in it had just stopped existing. This indifference of the universe, its absolute refusal to mourn along with him, felt like the cruelest thing he had ever experienced. He had witnessed cruelty in all its human forms, but the cruelty of a universe that did not care, that went on being beautiful while his mother lay on a mortuary slab, was something he had no weapon against. He broke things that night. He threw a glass against the wall and watched it shatter into a constellation of fragments on the floor. He swept his desk clean of papers and phones and the accumulated machinery of his criminal enterprise. And the crash of it all hitting the marble floor was satisfying for exactly 2 seconds before the silence returned, larger and emptier than before. He put his fist through the drywall beside the window and felt the skin on his knuckles split and the blood begin to flow. And the pain was almost a relief because it was something concrete, something he could point to and say, "This is where it hurts," which was more than he could do with the grief that was everywhere and nowhere, that had no location in his body, that seemed to inhabit every cell simultaneously. At 3 a.m, Arya called him. She did not ask how he was. She did not offer platitudes or reassurances. She simply said, "I am coming to you. Tell your guards to let me in." And 20 minutes later she was there, the small blind woman navigating the unfamiliar corridors of his waterfront compound with her white cane, finding her way to his study by following the sound of his breathing, which was ragged and broken in a way she had never heard from him before. She did not speak. She sat beside him on the floor where he had ended up, his back against the wall, his bleeding hand cradled in his lap, and she took his injured hand in both of hers and held it gently, feeling the cuts with her fingertips, assessing the damage with the care of someone who understood that physical wounds were sometimes easier to treat than the invisible ones. "You need ice for this," she said quietly. "I need my mother," he said, and his voice cracked on the word mother, and the tears came again. And Arya held him while he wept, rocking gently, her bell bracelet chiming softly in the darkness of the room, the sound somehow both heartbreaking and comforting, like a lullaby for a grown man who had forgotten how to be held. Arya held him through it. She held him through the dark nights when grief felt like drowning, when the silence of his compound on the waterfront felt like a tomb. She held him through the funeral, where hundreds of people came to pay their respects, some out of genuine love and some out of fear, and she stood beside him in her dark dress with her white cane and her silver bracelet and her blind eyes that somehow saw more clearly than anyone else's in the room. She did not ask him to be strong. She did not ask him to hurry through his mourning. She simply existed beside him, a steady presence, an anchor in the storm of loss. She sang at the funeral. She stood beside the altar in the church where Carmela had worshipped for decades, and she sang the Ave Maria one final time, and every person in the church wept, even the hardened men with scarred knuckles and weapons concealed beneath their suits, even the politicians who had come only to be seen, even the priest who had presided over hundreds of funerals and thought he had heard every variation of human grief expressed in song. In the weeks after the funeral, Dominic completed his withdrawal from the criminal world. He transferred his remaining operations to trusted lieutenants, sold his interests in various enterprises, and converted his wealth into legitimate business holdings. It was not a clean break. There were men who viewed his departure as an opportunity, who tested the boundaries of the new arrangement, who needed to be reminded that Dominic Vitale's retirement was voluntary and could be reversed if provoked. But the transition happened, slowly and painfully, like a bone being reset after a break. Dominic bought the building above Pena del Matino and renovated the apartment, creating a home designed for Arya's specific needs. Every surface was considered for texture. Every room was organized so she could navigate it independently. He installed a piano in the living room because she had mentioned once that she missed playing, that she had played as a child before the accident and had never been able to afford a piano of her own. The morning she first touched the keys, running her fingers across them with the reverent attention of someone greeting an old friend, Dominic stood in the doorway and watched and understood that this was what love looked like, not grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but the quiet act of paying attention to what someone needs and providing it without being asked. They built a life together. It was a small life by the standards Dominic had known, a life measured in morning coffee at the bakery counter, in afternoons singing at the hospital chapel, in evenings spent in the apartment above the bakery, Arya playing piano while Dominic sat beside her and described the sunset over the harbor in words that got better as he practiced. He learned Braille so he could read the books she loved. He learned to cook Carmela's recipes because Arya had strong opinions about food, and because the act of cooking for someone you love, of creating nourishment with your hands, felt like a form of redemption. On a morning in late spring, when the coastal city was drenched in the particular golden light that made the old quarter look like a painting, Dominic took Arya to the cliff overlooking the sea. He had walked the path himself the day before, removing loose stones, checking for hazards, ensuring that she could navigate it safely with her cane. They walked together through wild rosemary and thyme, the herbs releasing their fragrance as their feet crushed them, the sound of the sea growing louder as they approached the edge. "Why are we here?" Arya asked when they reached the promontory, the wind catching her black hair and streaming it behind her like a banner. "Because this is the most beautiful place I know," Dominic said, "and because I want you to feel it. The wind is coming from the south. The sea is 200 feet below us. The coast stretches in both directions as far as I can see. White cliffs and blue water, and the city behind us climbing the hillside. It's the kind of view that makes you believe the world was designed by someone who wanted it to be beautiful." Arya turned her face into the wind and smiled. "I can feel it," she said. "I can feel all of it. The salt and the rosemary and the warmth of the sun, and the way the wind sounds different when there's nothing between you and the horizon." Dominic took a small box from his pocket and placed it in her hands. She opened it by touch, her fingers finding the ring inside, a band of white gold set with a tiny bell that matched the bell on her silver bracelet. When she held it up, the two bells chimed together, creating a harmony that was both delicate and profound. "And I want to spend the rest of my life with you," Dominic said. "I want to be the man your voice taught me I could be. I want to build something that lasts, something good, something that would have made my mother proud." Arya slipped the ring onto her finger and stood at the edge of the cliff with the wind in her hair and the bells chiming on her hand, and her blind eyes turned toward a sea she could not see, but could feel in every cell of her body. "Yes," she said. "Yes to everything. Yes to you. Yes to the man you are becoming. Yes to the life we will build together." She reached up and found his face with her hands, tracing the scar across his eyebrow, the sharp line of his jaw, the tears that were falling freely down his cheeks. "Your mother is watching," she whispered. "She can see this. She can see you. And she is so proud." Dominic pulled her close and held her against his chest, and the bells on her wrist and her finger chimed softly in the wind, and the sea crashed against the cliffs below, and the city stretched behind them, and the future stretched before them, uncertain and terrifying and beautiful, and for the first time in his life, Dominic Vitale was not afraid. Thank you so much for staying with Dominic and Arya through every moment of this story, for believing in the possibility of redemption, for understanding that love is not about perfection, but about the daily choice to become better than you were yesterday. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to Crimson Vow Tales, hit that notification bell, and share this with someone who needs to believe that it's never too late to change. I read every single comment, and your words mean the world to me. Until next time, remember that even in the darkest stories, there is always a voice singing in the chapel. There is always light.